Good day, everybody, and welcome to the session on e-infrastructure. This paper is quite apt in the current era of the global pandemic. The need for communities, even poor people in the poorest of the poor areas, in rural areas, to be connected, to have affordable access to network has become paramount, and therefore we think that this is an important input and debate to be had in terms of how do we once and for all make serious inroads in terms of addressing the rural digital divide. What is the problem? Why have we written this paper? Well, simply put, rural South Africa, as well as other areas, have been underserved. The current area of broadband has accentuated this. We have a good plan and a vision for an vibrant information society, but the problem for rural poor still stand. And as a result, we're making a strong case that now is the time, more than ever, that we need decisive and holistic interventions to address the digital ecosystem beyond just that of access. So this paper provides a fresh look in our perspective as to how the digital divide in rural South Africa may be addressed. Just looking at some data briefly, you will see that compared to, if you take the ITU statistics, and here is the developing world, you'll see that as at 2018, South Africa is below the developing world trends in terms of internet penetration at a household level. And when it comes to rural South Africa, this is a far worse situation than 10.6%, underscoring therefore the need for us to come up with innovative solutions. The objectives of this paper are threefold, and in the presentation I shall just focus on firstly the definition of community network, after which we shall analyze bottlenecks and challenges from a policy perspective and advocate some reform in that regard. Let's start off by asking the question, what are community networks? Well, simply put, it's telecoms infrastructure that's installed, maintained, and operated by the community or some of its members to meet their own needs. So this underscores the role of communities, a bottom-up approach for providing telecoms services. And moreover, the importance of such a model is that it's able to contribute to the empowerment of marginalized populations, in that it's able to foster the local economy, provide employment, provide skills for those communities. Here's an example of a typical rural community, Mankosi in the Eastern Cape, fairly dispersed population in 30 square kilometers with just 580 households, low access to service, low income, low levels of education, a typical South African rural area. In this paper, our recommendations are based on Zenzelini Networks, which is a South African rural community network. It's actually founded in postdoctoral research by Dr. Carlos Rey Monero, co-author of this paper, and it's a spin-off between the university and the community in this area in the Eastern Cape. To date, there are two community cooperatives established, one in Mankosi and the other in Zitulele. Both are sanctioned by the communications regulator and hold exemptions, license exemptions for the maintenance and operation of the network. And jointly, both cooperatives have done substantive connectivity to date, connecting more than 13,000 people, a number of organizations, and more importantly, offering prices for internet connectivity that's as much as 20 times and more lower than those being offered by existing operators. The owners of the network are a cooperative. Here you see the Mankosi cooperative, which are members of the community, and they've been incepted since 2013, and the cooperatives are the legal owners of the network. This shows you the Zenzelini network in Mankosi. You see here the purple lines show you the actual network. These are wireless infrastructure, and these are location of the towers. What you see in green is technically the network coverage. Should the cooperatives have access to the appropriate spectrum, a point which we'll come to later on. Here's some examples when we say bottom up, communities doing it for themselves. Here are community members in training, being taught how to configure the network, how to install equipment. Here's further examples of the training taking place. So the notion of community networks is not new. There are several examples around the world, in Latin America, in Asia, etc. Our project, Zenzelini, is one of the better known South African community networks. But it's been gaining attention, and more recently, for example, at the level of the United Nations, this Eastern Cape Community Network was actually cited in a report of the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on digital cooperation, in which they say that many local groups are also working on small-scale community solutions, and, for example, a rural community in Menkosi. So even at such a high level, the model for community networks is being looked at closely as a means of expanding access to digital infrastructure. So if we agree, and if at the highest levels there's attention of on the community network model, why is the model not pervasive? Why do we just have, for example, Zenzelini being just currently located in 2 villages in the Eastern Cape? Why do we not connect more of rural South Africa, or as much of rural South Africa as possible, if we have a viable model? Well, there are bottlenecks and challenges in the current policy regime, which don't make this as easy as one would like it to be. And so let's examine some of them. Well, first and foremost, we want to argue that this is a particular model of telecoms, and therefore we need a special category for network licensing if the rural divide is to be addressed with speed. And furthermore, that in the current era, that there should be a faster process for obtaining license exemption, but in future, that certainly we're saying that there should be a special category for licensing community networks. There are examples of this. Uganda's regulator recently has provided such a license for community networks, and there are examples in Latin America, such as in Mexico, where regulators have begun to recognize and provide such licenses. The next important challenge we'd like to draw attention to is that of spectrum. Our view is that radio spectrum is a national resource which must be used to advance the plight of the poor. And given that the community network model emphasizes a socialist perspective of telecoms, we feel that spectrum therefore should not just be auctioned off to the highest bidders, but the regulators and government, with policy directives to the regulator, should provide some latitude for poor communities to use spectrum for their own benefit, in a manner such as we're demonstrating in the Eastern Cape. So, for example, if the Zenzelini operators, if the cooperatives were to be given the appropriate spectrum, they would immediately be able to cover a far wider geographical area than they currently do, thereby serving many, many more poor people in other villages in which the current network would have reach to. So, still keeping on the issue of spectrum, we've found that there are mobile operators currently who have assigned spectrum in rural areas, but they are not deploying it in such areas. And probably because it doesn't make market sense for them to deploy infrastructure in such areas. So we would like to very strongly advocate that if operators have licensed spectrum, and that if they have no business case in a particular rural area, then they should be able to share it with community networks. And so therefore we're advocating that in the 800 megahertz and 2.6 gigahertz bands, that there should be a use it or share it provision, as opposed to what's currently advocated as a use it or lose it. But we are saying, no, we rather think that if you are not using it in a particular area, then it should be shared. We'd like to then turn our attention to the wireless open access network. In South Africa, there's been much debate, and the work towards a wireless open access network is at an advanced stage. The regulator has recently asked for comment. But our view is that this network is unlikely to focus on the least served areas in the first instance. And so it's not on its own going to address the rural divide. So we are still arguing that notwithstanding the deployment or potential deployment of a WOAN, that complementary strategies are needed to address the rural divide. And when the WOAN is eventually operating fully, it then could possibly serve a useful role in supporting community networks. But we don't see this happening in the short to medium future. So therefore, we are advocating strongly that within the paradigm of a wireless open access network, that there should be a social purpose license for community networks to access some of the spectrum in the bands that the WOAN is targeting to support communities to set up community networks. And to be specific, we are suggesting that at least 2 by 5 megahertz of spectrum in the 800 megahertz band should be set aside for non-profit black-owned small operators, including community network cooperatives. Then we want to focus then on Wi-Fi for a moment, because Wi-Fi has been hugely successful, serving many wireless ISPs and community networks. But particularly, we want to draw attention to the regulation of output power in the bands used by Wi-Fi, where there's a great disparity in the power levels that are allowed. So if you take Canada, for example, their regulation in the 2.4 gigahertz band enables links above 30 kilometers in point-to-point networks, whereas South Africa's regulations only allow links of about 2 kilometers. So where we were to adjust such regulations, we'd be able to make far more useful applications of Wi-Fi spectrum. So in conclusion, we argue that our paper does present evidence that a community network model can be operationalized despite regulatory challenges. The evidence at hand provides a cogent case that a community network model is an innovative solution to address the digital divide, especially in rural geographies. However, the model will only be sustainable if, in the first place, the observed regulatory challenges are addressed. I want to stress, though, that the regulatory challenges would make it easier in terms of deploying a network. There are other issues in the digital ecosystem, which we shall speak about on other occasions, but this focuses on the access layer. So we want to conclude by focusing or highlighting 3 recommendations. The first is that of a licensing regime for community networks and the need for a special category of network licenses. 2, for license exemptions for both access and backhaul, and the success of Wi-Fi, which suggests that more spectrum should be opened up on a license exempt basis. Thirdly, that the provision of licensed spectrum for mobile services also need to be considered, so that small operators and community networks are also able to provide mobile services in rural areas beyond what they're currently doing with the limited resources they have at hand. And we want to emphasize that the use it and share it principle in terms of operators who are not using their current spectrum in rural areas. So thank you very much for listening. I want to stress that the presentation hasn't been able to cover all of the policy and regulatory proposals we're making, and I would urge you to read the full paper, which is in the conference proceedings. Thank you very much for listening.